Hello and welcome to another 10 rows a day tutorial. In this video I'll show you how to add a lifeline to your work when you have stitch markers in your knitting. Okay, you start adding a lifeline to your work with the wool needle and a piece of scrap yarn, just like I have here, and then you come across your stitch marker, the one that's already sitting in your work. What do you do with that guy? The general rule of thumb is not to go through the stitch mark, and don't go like that. That's not good. Why? Because if you do, then the lifeline, I'll do it just to show you how it's going to look. So that's bad, because as you keep knitting more and more rows, those rows will get trapped between the lifeline on the stitch marker and the needle, because the same stitch marker would be sitting on the needle still and on the lifeline. So that's not a good idea. Your work will look like this, and that's not good. It gets stretched, some stitches get bigger, some stitches stay small, so it's not good. Don't do that, okay? Don't go inside the stitch marker. Now that's the point when we need to decide whether we want to keep the stitch marker in the work or not. If you have a couple stitch markers and you know where they are, let's say this one is four stitches in from the edge of the work, so it's pretty easy to put it back in if you have one or two stitch markers. So you can easily just discard them, in terms of you don't put them on the lifeline. So you go around the stitch marker like this. See, you go around and the lifeline doesn't pass through the stitch marker, because we already know that's no good. But what if you have more stitch markers? I'm gonna remove this one just to show you what to do in a case when you want to keep them, when you want to keep track of the stitch markers. Because what's going to happen, I mean, it's not gonna happen, but it can happen if you do need to use the lifeline later on to unravel your work, and you unravel the rows, then your lifeline will keep just the stitches. So that means you will have to reinsert every one of those stitch markers in their spot where they belong, so you can continue on. And if you have a lot of stitch markers, or they are in crucial positions in your knitting and it will be hard to calculate where exactly to put them back, then you have to keep the spots where the stitch markers are, to keep them marked on the lifeline. And for that we need an additional set of stitch markers. I usually use those little rubber bands, tiny little guys that I normally don't use as stitch markers, because I'm really not a huge fan of rubber. I just prefer plastic stitch markers to rubber ones, but they serve me well when I have to mark spots on the lifeline. So what do? You thread the lifeline through the first group of stitches. When you come to the stitch marker, you take one of your additional markers and put it on the lifeline. Then you thread the other group of stitches from one stitch marker to the other, just like this. So my stitch markers, they mark the pattern repeats, but yours could be for other different reasons. In your knitting, it doesn't really matter. The thing is that if you want to keep the spots marked, then you have to add the additional stitch markers. And then another group of stitches until we come to the next stitch marker, and I add another rubber band. And keep going like that until you thread the lifeline through all the stitches and you mark spots for all your stitch markers. And my last marker of a stitch marker, that's the funny name, and the last group of stitches. Here we go. The lifeline is in. It does take an extra few minutes to do that. I'm gonna just redistribute the lifeline. But those extra few minutes, it's nothing compared to the big issue that you're gonna have if you unravel those few rows and then have to put the stitch markers back in. So these little guys, they basically save you much more time later on if you need to use your lifeline and unravel your stitches later on. So I'm gonna knit a few rows just with the lifeline and the markers of the stitch markers in there, and I'm gonna show you later on what happens when we do unravel those rows and how to return the actual stitch markers back to work. So see you in a few rows. And here we go. So 2 rows later, what do we see here in our work? The actual stitch markers, they moved up because we made 2 rows, right? But those little rubber bands, they are still in the work, staying there and marking the spots where the stitch markers were. So now if we need to unravel the work, what happens? I just take the needle out. See, all of the stitch markers, they just got loose. I unravel those 2 rows that I knit, and I've got all my stitches on the lifeline, as well as those little friends, our rubber bands. They mark the spots where the stitch markers were. Now when we pick stitches from the lifeline, just like this, we come to the spot where the rubber band is, and we know this is the place where we need to add a stitch marker. Then you don't run the needle through the rubber band, you put it to the side, let it sit there just in case, who knows, maybe we'll need to unravel the work again. Hopefully not, but you never know. And I come to the next spot where the rubber band is, so that's the place where I put another stitch marker. And you go on and on like that until you have all your stitches and all your stitch markers back into work. Just like this. And you don't unravel the lifeline for now, because like I said, we might use it later on. When the time comes and you need to move the lifeline up, when you work another 5-10 centimeters to 4 inches of knitting and you want to move it up, then you simply yank the lifeline off from the work. The rubber bands will come loose, same way as our stitch markers did, and you thread the lifeline into the wool needle and do it all over again, just like we did earlier in this video. And that's it. Your stitch markers are safe, your stitches are safe, and you're a happy knitter. See, once you decide whether you want to keep the stitch markers in your work or not, it's pretty easy to insert the lifeline. If you like to use Lifeline, if you want to know more about how to use it and why, click the link in the description. Thank you for watching this video and stay tuned.